All right, so we're recording. We're not broadcasting. Hey, my name is William Powell. I'm with the Sci-Fi Center here in Las Vegas, and I am probably going to butcher your name because I really just realized I've never had to say it out loud. This is Dawson Weidrich.
Close,
Weidrich, am I right?
Weidrich, you're close. You're closer than most people get. So
that was one of my other options, but I figured I would sound it out first. This is Dawson. Dawson's an artist. He does his own comic book. We're going to hit on that later. We'll post advertisements for that too. He does a lot of artwork in there. Been wanting to do this for a while. 36 years ago, I cannot believe I'm that old. 36 years ago, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight hit the stand. This was right at the beginnings of my comic book collection. I had been collecting for 3 years, I think, when this comic book came out, and Batman to me wasn't the same afterwards. I mean, within an instant, and I'm going to show you guys exactly what I mean by the sea change. Within an instant, in 1986, we went from this.
Oh man!
We went from this.
Let's go! Ah, I love that. Love it so much.
To that. And I prefer this. All right, so that is where we were at as far as Batman storytelling. I had grown up with that TV show, and anybody who's going to be listening to this, I am not knocking Adam West Batman. I grew up with that Batman. That was my first Batman. There's nothing wrong with that Batman. But as I grew into a teenager, as I grew into an adult, those stories just weren't doing it for me. 1986 comes along. Dark Knight Returns, issue 1 hits the stands. And this is when I first had to start going to comic book stores, because you weren't prior to that. You had to get your comic books, for me, where I was living, from 7-Eleven or at a grocery store.
Yeah.
All right. This was one of the very first things that I purchased from a comic book store, and it changed everything. It changed the tone. It changed what was allowable to be told as far as a Batman story. He could be violent.
Mm-hmm.
He could brutalize people. He could terrorize people. This story drew him, in my opinion, closer to what Bob Kane intended him to be. And like I said, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have a lot of the things that you could really dive into the character. We had the physical media that we had, and that was it. So this became like a Bible. It also allowed for other storytelling to be told. Without this happening, you don't get the Killing Joke. You don't get Batman Year 1, Batman Year 2, Batman Year 3, and the sheer violence that they unloaded. I don't even think, and you can make an argument that if this doesn't put Batman back on the map, you don't get a 1989 Michael Keaton movie in the same fashion that you did when it came out. Once again, you weren't born, but trust me, Batman was not on the radar as much as it was after, in those 3 years. From 1986 to 1989 might, in my opinion, be the most important era for Batman. That's also the era where Jason Todd was killed, when we had the 900 number to kill Jason Todd, and Batman 428. It was, everybody was wearing Batman shirts after that. It was different. So I always credit this book as the most influential, one of the most influential miniseries or comic book stories ever made. And we're going to go ahead and bring it up. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to pick up these stories and have only referenced them, here it is right there. All 4 issues as they were released, how they looked when they were released. It was the first comic I ever bought that was in a bookshelf format. I mean, I was paying 75 cents in 1986. Comics were 75 cents a book.
Wouldn't that be nice?
When this came out, yeah, I know. Now they're averaging $3.95 or $4.95, and if you're lucky, and they don't go up, you get a Virgin cover, you might be paying even more than that. But this was groundbreaking. Stories like this weren't coming out like this. It was this and Watchmen. Those were, and we'll get to Watchmen in a couple of weeks. But these 2 storylines really changed it. There was a separation between the sophisticated buyer that hung out at a comic book store, which is what I would become, and ultimately what I would end up becoming, and the person who just vaguely knew of these characters. I mean, everybody knows who Batman is. Everybody knows who Joker is. Everybody, whether they picked up a comic book, understands who even Alfred Pennyworth is. But they didn't understand it on this level. They didn't understand what Frank Miller was ready to say. And that's my introduction. That's why it is so important to me. Dawson, what does the Dark Knight Returns mean to you?
Well, like you mentioned, I was actually born 11 years after the series ended up debuting. So, and also kind of preface it, my family wasn't a big comic book family growing up. We were very much a sports-oriented family, lived in small towns where sports is everything. And as you know, the early MCU movies, or like the X-Men movies and the Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire, were coming out, we got a little bit more into the superhero characters and want to learn more about it. And I started to kind of get slowly more into Batman as the Dark Knight trilogy came out. And one of the main stories I kept getting told by people who were into comics to check out was The Dark Knight Returns. And then, of course, Batman v Superman's trailers come out, and I see all the different advertisement for it, and it's like, hey, check out these stories in order to understand this movie, or to know where it's pulling from, what inspiration it's pulling from. And, of course, listed again was The Dark Knight Returns. So I feel like for several years, The Dark Knight Returns is just something that was kept on being pushed to the back of my mind, kept on being mentioned to me and pushed to the back of my mind, until finally, I decided to, I had to get a digital copy the first time I read it, which fortunately enough for me, that's not the case anymore. Got myself my own physical copy, including the single issues as well, which I'm very, very excited to have those. Got those recently. But it's actually one of the first main Batman stories that I fully dived into and just dissected and just read through again and again, trying to find all these different little tidbits. And it's one of the ones, like you said, has influenced a lot of Batman's like stories for the past, 20 some odd, 30 some odd, 40 some years, right? And it makes it to where Batman can be taken in a more darker or serious note. And I think if it weren't for that, I probably wouldn't be nearly as big of a Batman fan as I am today. Because when it comes to me and graphic novels and comic book reading, I like stories that take the characters seriously. I like the stories that put a character in a very interesting and dangerous situation, and that doesn't necessarily go overboard with the maturity, but treats it in a mature way, to where they're allowed to be violent. They're allowed to have psychological things going on. There's allowed to be psychological intrigue, and that's exactly what you get with The Dark Knight Returns. And of course, this also introduced me to the great world of Frank Miller, right? And Frank Miller, of course, is a comic book icon, doing great works for, Daredevil, Elektra, Batman. And you see all this stuff. In fact, I've collected several of these issues recently. But, I mean, he's been such a heavy hitter in the comic industry for years. And when he did this, like you said, the landscape of Batman changed, like forever. A lot of people try to argue that's for the worse, but a lot of people will argue, justifiably so, that it was for the better. It made it to where Batman was taken seriously. Yeah. He was more gritty. You were able to more approach his psychological trauma that he experienced because of course, the death of his parents in front of him as an 8-year-old child, which just makes sense. And I just think this story is one that really made the Batman character click for me in general. Without this story, I think you'd be seeing a lot less Batman books on my shelf. I'll tell you that much right now, because everything else is at least somewhat derived from that maturity level and that darkness and psychological aspects of the story. So it means a lot to me. And again, I probably have this to credit for all the books that are on my shelf in general.
Yeah. And that goes for a lot of people, and that goes for a lot of books that would have never even been produced if it weren't for this one story. Yeah. The biggest question, and here's where why I really wanted to do the Sci-Fi Center Presents as a way to either reintroduce these stories to people or make the connections for them. Where do we get started with this? And it actually doesn't begin in The Dark Knight Returns, the first issue. It actually begins back in 1980 with these covers that we see up here now. Frank Miller, 1980 issue at 7980, issue 158 of Daredevil. He takes over Daredevil, and he introduces a way of storytelling that just wasn't happening anywhere at that time. He was the first time, and I'd read previous episodes or issues and back issues of the previous writers that were doing Daredevil, and it wasn't the same. What Frank Miller did, and he does this in any of this stuff, and he does this in Dark Knight, is it was the first time that Hell's Kitchen became a component in the story. Hell's Kitchen, its gritty atmosphere, its corruption, it's everything became just the biggest part of the story as Daredevil and anybody else. He also introduced elements to some of the most edgiest villains to his run with Elektra and Bullseye. And the issues 181 to 184 after Elektra dies and he's going at it with the Punisher are some of the best episodes ever. When he's taunting, this is a superhero, who is sitting in the bed after he's caused Bullseye to be paralyzed and in traction, and he's playing Russian roulette with a revolver to a helpless Bullseye. He was that kind of psychological terror that your hero could put upon your villain. That was the first time I had seen that.
Right.
And when he changed that game and they allowed him to do that, it gave him leverage to come over to DC Comics and basically do the same thing with Batman. But it all begins here. I recommend, there's 2 runs of Daredevil that everyone has to read. That's the Bendis run. Bendis run is some of the best comics I've ever read. And the original Frank Miller run. He came back for another run with Born Again and all that. And Born Again is a great storyline. But this storyline right here, you see a lot of it. If you have not read these yet and you were looking to read something that kind of attaches to what we're talking about today, it's the same guy doing the same things. And this is where he first hooked up with Klaus Janson, which would become a marriage that would last a very long time and end up in a lot of very good illustrations. So that is
and another thing with Daredevil. Another run of Daredevil with Frank Miller that I'd highly recommend to anybody is the 5-issue miniseries that he did with John Romita Jr. of Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. And
that is beautiful.
So beautiful. Beautiful, what's it called? Foil covers. And the story is just fantastic. Basically a prequel or like an introduction to the Daredevil character. That's one that I've read several times over, where, again, it's a similar instance of Frank Miller really just taking the character seriously and showing the different aspects of Hell's Kitchen, like you mentioned, making a character, much like how Gotham is a character in all of Batman's stories. He made Hell's Kitchen a big character for the Daredevil runs.
Yeah, the most gripping part of that series you just brought up that I will always remember is how they illustrated his Jack Murdock, his father, being killed because he wouldn't take the bribe, and so they beat him up, and then they kill him out on the lot. And he sees that, and then he comes on, and you get to, like I said, Daredevil from that point on, even when Bendis took it over, they used the city and the people that lived in it, and that's a trait that not only did Frank Miller, originate, in my opinion, in Daredevil and take over to The Dark Knight. If you look at the movie that was just released in the Batman, that is being done there.
Exactly.
The atmosphere of the city of Gotham is just as much of that story as the Penguin, the Riddler, Selina Kyle, Bruce Wayne, Batman. The city is the backdrop. That movie does not work without the city. And the same way The Dark Knight Returns does not work without what the city has become.
And, exactly. The way that the city kind of goes against him in the story and how it's a constant struggle to maintain that balance for a lot of these heroes, and Batman doesn't care about it. Like you hit the nail on the head. That was one of the main things I loved about this new Batman movie, was the fact that, Gotham is an integral part of the story. And if it's not there, and if it's just simply like a background Gotham, like from, in my opinion, the Dark Knight trilogy's Gotham was, that it just doesn't work nearly as well, because you lose that aesthetic, you lose that story aspect that makes the whole thing just come together well.
Yeah, and we just obviously we just celebrated the 6th anniversary of Batman versus Superman. Yes. Now, obviously, for us geeks, this was never a new concept for us, right? I mean, bring Zack Snyder, and I'll show you other illustrations where you clearly see his references and his homage to the Dark Knight. But look at this. People say Batman, why would he ever fight Superman? There are several reasons why this storyline would ever happen, but here you go. 36 years ago, before there were any comic book movies to speak of, Frank Miller had it down, and he even uses the same way. Technically, he uses the same way to defeat Superman here as he does in BVS.
Right.
But look at these breakdowns. Another thing that broke ground with this, the violence that was portrayed on the pages was something that a lot of DC comics, other than Legion of Superheroes for me at the time, which was extremely violent, But a lot of the mainline comics didn't want to take their character into this dark area. And a lot of these guys grew up. I mean, 1966 is when Batman and Adam West came on. So a lot of these guys that were running the show and buying the comics were heavily influenced like that. They could not imagine this. And it took Frank Miller's Dark Knight to remind them of the sheer violence that he's capable of. When he beats the hell out of those mutants in the Dark Knight, and I think I have that on one of these panels. I was so reminded of when he's beating those fools in the Batman.
You know? Yeah, no, it's very accurate. And like, you just look at these panels. These are some of the most iconic panels in comic book history. And you mentioned BVS and the comparisons that it has, and like you said, you'll probably have some pictures of it. But every time, like I just watched or rewatched Batman v Superman with Anthony on the ACS Universe yesterday. And every time I watch that movie and then I read The Dark Knight Returns, seeing the things that they utilize from the book, almost to a T, the way that Batman's armor is damaged, the way the fight goes, the way he takes down Superman, it honestly shows just how much of a love letter that movie is to comic book fans, especially of Frank Miller Batman fans, and just how much attention to detail it is, and how again iconic this story has been for so many people. Because heck, you could have had people that hadn't read the story in like 10 years watch the movie and recognize it because it's just so iconic. Like, hey, that's from the book. He said this from the book. Even the way they introduced the movie or announced it in general back in, what was it, 2014 or 2015, right? They even used dialogue from The Dark Knight Returns to announce it. And people in the crowd, you can hear them in the video gasping because they realized, holy crap, they're using this as a concept.
And what he does, the narration, the way, and for those of you who have read The Dark Knight, the way you hear Bruce, before you even see him, the way you hear him speaking about the city, I was reminded of that when you hear Robert Pattinson Batman doing before you even see him. Some of the things he's saying about the city, some of the things he's saying, I can't be everywhere, but to them, I can be anywhere. Right. That's the kind of terror that Frank Miller is trying to portray. And I think the kind of terror that really Bob Kane was trying to portray. Yeah. What people, and I talk to them every day when they tell me Batman is not dark, Batman is not this, Batman wouldn't kill, Batman wouldn't do this or that, right? Mm-hmm. You got to understand the era of what birthed most of these superheroes. It was open gang warfare. Your front page had guys with 2 bullet holes through their eye holes. You had Dillinger being shot and the cops standing right next to his body. I mean, and people were living in cities where these things were happening. You had what was happening to the Jewish population in Europe in the same time. Right. We hadn't entered the war yet. Most of these guys who were creating these things were of Jewish descent or second generation, first generation. Joe Simon Schuster, all these guys, and they knew people back in the old country. So when they were making these superheroes, they were making somebody who they wish could be there to kind of combat the things that they were living through all over the world. Yeah. And Batman's darkness was a part of that I think because of the Adam West thing, and in large part, I know I'm going to catch hell for this, Batman the Animated Series. Yeah. Because Batman the Animated Series is sophisticated as it was. Batman the Animated Series was geared for kids. It was geared for a certain age group. And what happened? That age group was born, and after I picked up this, and that became their Batman. That Batman is brutal some ways, but he's not this. He's not what Robert Pattinson is. And I think a lot of guys who ends up in their 20s and 30s and they're approaching their 40s now, that was their Batman. Mm-hmm. That was a more detective, more. But like I said, with Bob Kane, from what I understood from reading of his work, it was violence. We had people that were literally being put into ovens in Europe. And we had Superman being created by. I mean, these were the things that they came from, and I think because we were removed from that generation, we don't understand that. And
well, another thing is that like these early iterations, these characters, both Batman and Superman, like you mentioned, they kind of originated from dark places, right? Like you even read some of the war stories of Superman in the early days of his comic publications. He did some kind of dark things, like he'd take some criminals who were flying a plane and just throw them out the plane. And Batman in his early days also used guns.
He
many
used a gun.
times.
He shot people.
Right.
And
it was
people.
dark.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about this is that it shows that these characters have gone through an evolutionary process of starting off in a darker way, transitioning to be more kid-oriented and more child-friendly, to being very bright, colorful, and happy, which has its place, absolutely. And then you have the era of The Dark Knight Returns, where it kind of takes these characters back to where they started. And it brings them back into the way and like more mature take that they were originally sort of intended. And honestly, that's another thing I'm very grateful for The Dark Knight Returns in doing, because again, if it weren't for that, if it weren't for it bringing it back more to a more mature or darker storytelling sense, I don't know if I'd be nearly as interested in it. I feel like I'd be more in the camp of people who only read stuff like Watchmen, for instance, because I like the more darker, more, in a way, realistic approach to comic book storytelling.
Yeah, I outgrew certain versions of Batman. I've outgrown on certain versions of certain characters to the point where I could no longer accept Adam West and Dick Ward as my Batman anymore. And it's not to, like I said, knock them. I had them. I don't think I would have gotten to the point where I could appreciate The Dark Knight Returns without having something to juxtapose it on too. This look at these images, like this one right here. This is probably, to me, one of the most iconic images of the 80s comics for me, is this fight, these covers with him fighting Superman, and the armor, to see that armor come back in BVS, to see that fight. I mean, and to see that this guy, and that's why, like I said, I'm biased when it comes to Zack Snyder, not just because of the DC content exclusively, even though I my favorite movie of him is the one we're going to do here very soon, which is Watchmen. 300. Here's another Frank Miller collaboration where he takes it scene by scene. You look like you're watching a comic book, but not to the point where you're not making a movie. And he does that here. And when I'm watching BVS, I see this. And I like I said, I grew up with these images of him. And there's a couple more that I put, just because I was just trying to think of images that really have stuck with me my entire life, because and there's like this one right here. Let's go with all right. So here's one of the things I'm gonna pull up. So right here, now we all recognize this. We all recognize this machine right here. Right. I mean, we remember when he here's the mutant at the bottom there.
Yes.
He's rolling them up, and then you have things like this. You look at that very thing, and let's see where I got my overlay here. I had a side by side of the one he did. Let me pull it up here, because this was the one thing when I watched the 4-hour cut, when I watched Zack Snyder's Justice League, when I got to see this, it really made my day.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about when they showed it in the teaser for the movie. Golly, it's just so spot on.
And I'm like, I didn't have words, because I'm like, this is a guy who took my visions that I had as a kid and some of the most iconic nerve points, and he nailed it with this. This is exactly the same Batmobile.
Yeah, I mean, even with the moving front of the belt, the tank, basically, and how it looks, just everything is just so accurate about it. And you mentioned just some of the great imagery of this book. This, like I mentioned, this book has some of the most iconic Batman imagery that honestly I've ever seen. I mean, you have Batman riding a horse after the city goes through a blackout. You have the Joker on the talk show. You have Superman when he's taking down the nuke. You have Batman and Carrie Kelly like basically jumping through the air over the city lights of Gotham.
I had a statue of that. That was my favorite. Oh wow!
That makes me so jealous.
Oh, the one with the other one I used to have is where she has the slingshot. I sold that one, but it was I mean,
so freaking awesome. But you mentioned Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, and Lynn Varley. I mean, that's a team up that, in my opinion, has almost yet to be beat. There's plenty of great artists out there that I absolutely love. A lot of modern artists that I absolutely love. Yes, the Mutant Gang. Done so well.
This is that Zack Snyder stuff is right at the top there. Those are the mutants.
Yep. And Jay Oliva even confirmed it.
Yeah, then they're sitting at the base of that one scene I just showed you with the thing. So he's fighting the mutants. Zack Snyder wasn't playing around when we put this together. And like I said, I know people every time they hear the name Zack Snyder, sometimes you either love him or hate him. But if you are a visionary and you read this stuff like I did, you never dreamed that you would get anything like this.
Never.
And to get it, and like I said, and you have the movies that came out, the influence that came out, and like I said, Klaus Janson, his ink jobs on the back of Frank Miller's artwork to me made him a legend. Klaus Janson 100%. He's a great artist in his own right. He did Punisher, he did his own thing. He's got a nice, really sketchy style, like a Bill Sienkiewicz style. I loved Klaus Janson, but he made his bones as an inker for Frank Miller because he carried him over. Yeah. Carried him over for Daredevil. He carried him over to this, and he just gave it that feel. And I'm like, wow, dude.
And their team up it's not just that it's just good art. It's that it's distinctive. You know, as soon as you see it, who it's done by. It's like, oh, that's Frank Miller and Klaus Janson. You know, as soon as you look at it, because it's such a distinct and unique style. Some people like myself and you as well, we love it. It's very unique and very fun and very, very gritty. Some people don't like it as much because it can be a little bit odd. Like, for instance, you have Bruno, who's a member of the Mutant Gang with basically swastikas for a bra. So there's some odd things in there, but at the same time, it's just so iconic and lovable because it's just, there's so much care put into it. And with the coloring of Lynn Varley, I mean, my gosh, the paint
they would collaborate several more times. Yeah.
Oh yes.
It was. I like I said. Remember, this was. I'm 12 now. I'm 12 when I'm buying this, and I had to get permission from my dad because they wouldn't sell it. This was something that you got to realize in 1986. You know, you had to get a permission slip just to go to certain things. Yeah. And so I had to get permission from my dad. I remember. But we had grown up with horror movies, and I had already been able to take things into context and know that what I read and what I see on TV, I'm not going to go to school and beat the hell out of somebody, you know, or Jason puts an axe to somebody's head. That doesn't mean that I can do it. I had already grown up in that atmosphere to where the lines were drawn. So my old man, he had no problem with me. He loved Batman. He didn't understand this treatment of Batman because, once again, my dad came up through Adam West.
Right.
And, you know, the comics at the time, and also the comic stories that were being told were being influenced by a lot of that. And then you have the super fans and you have all these things. And like I said, once again, with Batman, the animated series, a lot of the mid 90s comics started to influence a certain type of storytelling that was coming from them, which is fine, but it's just not to me. It just wasn't what Batman is. It just didn't portray, like the Dark Knight, the true sociopath that this guy is. And he believes in himself to the point where he believes even at 50, he can come back and he can make a difference. You know, he can come back and he realizes that he's not the same guy anymore. And then the whole Robin thing, the fact that he's having PTSD, we didn't even call it PTSD back then, but he's having PTSD because remember, he's lost to Robin.
Yeah. I mean, this Batman really shaped a lot of how I feel about Batman in general. Like you just mentioned, Batman's a sociopath. He's got some issues going on, and it totally makes sense. Again, when you look at a character whose parents were shot and killed in front of him as an 8-year-old boy, and then decides to utilize fear to fight crime in the city that he loves, there's something going on upstairs, right? There's something going wrong, and it makes it to where he's just so interesting, and it makes it to where he's a flawed hero that you root for, a flawed hero that goes out and does things that other people can't, because he's not restricted. And one of my favorite lines of Batman that I feel like is very much inspired by this version of Batman is, I believe it's in the story Batman Hush. I might be mistaken, but Batman is talking to Superman in whatever story this was. And he says, you're doing that because deep down, Clark, you're a good person. And deep down, I'm not. And I feel like that's exactly directed from this, because deep down, he wants to punish these criminals to the full extent. But he, of course, sets limits for himself, But again, he's still going out there, and as an old man, when he technically shouldn't be doing this, he's going out and beating criminals to a pulp because he loves to do it. That's who he is. He's not Bruce Wayne anymore. Bruce Wayne died when he was 8 years old. Batman was born then, and that's who he is.
Yeah. Another thing that I think that I actually had a chance to interview Mark Waid a few years back on a podcast we were doing, and I asked him what kind of stuff influences him, and Dark Knight came up. But one of those things that, like the quote you gave from Hush, there's another quote in a story that we're going to do later on down the road as far as part of the most influential miniseries ever to be done, and that's Kingdom Come.
Right.
There's an older Batman in that story that's, in my opinion, is heavily influenced by Dark Knight. But Absolutely. Superman brings him back. This time they meet, and they're about to go to the final battle, and he's trying to get Bruce Wayne to care. He's like, "Why should I care about any of this?" And he said that, and this is my favorite quote, is that because deep down, beneath the costumes, beneath the mask, beneath Superman and Batman, we're two people that don't want to see people die needlessly, and that connects to me to the Martha comment that every time I hear people mistake that comment for something, he's Martha, that's what he said her. I have to restrain myself. I have to hold the backhand back because that was one of my favorite lines. That was the turning point for me in BBS. And it wasn't just because his name was Martha. I mean, if you're a Cro-Magnon and that's what you thought, then I'm sorry that you paid money for that movie and that's how you feel. Like, there's nothing I can do for it. To me, it was the part of Batman. He became what he became to stop what he went through from happening to anyone else over and over. Every time he beats the hell out of a criminal, he's reliving that. He's stopping something that he couldn't stop. He was 8-9 years old when his Martha was killed. There was nothing he could do. So he basically became what he was to stop another orphan from being created. Now here he is staring down another person who's about to become an orphan. Someone else is about to lose their Martha, but this time he can do something about it. What he became Batman to prevent, he can now do. And when he says Martha's not going to die tonight, he is keeping a promise that he could not have kept for his Martha, and he's coming full circle. And I love that moment of Batman. And then when I hear people make fun of that moment, that's like the line between, okay, now how can we continue this conversation, or are you serious? Because I got
you know then and there that you're like, okay, now I can't really have a serious conversation with you now because you're not able to really think that way.
Yeah, and then not to call anybody dumb, but
right.
And I understand if it didn't resonate with you, but when I hear people make fun of it, I'm like, you truly need to understand the Batman character and what, even in the Dark Knight.
Yeah.
In the Dark Knight, when he's about to put on the costume and the Bat, he's talking to him, you can't escape me, you can't escape the night. All these things are in his head. You have to understand what's in Bruce Wayne's head. And I think the Dark Knight at that point in time did it better than anybody that was doing it at the time. And when you go from here, you go from the Dark Knight, and the very next year you had Batman Year One with Frank Miller and Musichelli. And then you had Batman Year Two, and then you had Batman Year Three, and you got increasingly more violent. Before, if you look at a lot of the blood in the Dark Knight Returns, I challenge you to find anywhere in this book where he's just sheerly beating the hell out of people, where there's a lot of blood. All right, well, by the way, this is what we were talking about. This is iconic right here.
Oh, it's so freaking good. Right. I love that pose.
But he's violently beating people throughout. He's breaking necks. He's doing all this stuff. And if you notice, like in that scene right there, that's supposed to be blood.
Yeah.
Right. And what they did is they made the blood either brown or gray because that was a compromise, in my opinion, and between it being over the top. And one of the things I noticed in the Batman, that is PG-13, is that there's not a lot of blood, even though there should be. When he's beating that bull, remember in the movie, the Batman is blocking bullets with his gauntlets. So that means those bad boys are tough. He's taking those same gauntlets that can stop bullets, and he's pounding your skull. First of all, you're dead.
Especially when you're hammer fisting people,
He's hitting them hard. All right, and he's getting up, and those other fools are like, okay, we're done. But that guy's not getting up. And
No.
when Penguin tumbles 4 or 5 times and lands on the top of that car, Oswald Cobblepot is dead. R.I.P. He's done. But yet, here he goes. But yeah, they got away from showing the blood that Batman should be. If you really wanted to really go overboard, because he's beating people, he's compound fracturing people, he's doing all kinds of stuff. And that's the one thing I noticed years and years after I read The Dark Knight, that fact that that's not mud, that's blood. But they compromised so that, because he was pushing the envelope further than anyone had pushed it at that time.
Right.
You gotta, like I said, being a collector then and knowing what was the mainstream stuff, the edgiest stuff you could get was Legion of Superheroes with Keith Giffen, because there was some violence going on there, and the X-Men. Right. Because 86 was a really banner year for comic books. Because guess what happened in 1986 with the X-Men? Mutant Massacre.
Yeah.
Mutant Massacre, as far as one of the things that changed the game for DC and being the Dark Knight, Mutant Massacre changed the course of comics.
Right.
It pushed X-Men to the top, and they would stay there for years and years and years. It killed characters that you were familiar with en masse. They brought in characters that you could not write around their violence. See, with Batman, you can actually write in, if you wanted to, you can write around a character that is a soft guy. You just, you can super friend him.
Right.
Chris Claremont took it to a new level, and he surrounded himself. And this is, we're going to do the Mutant Massacre too. There's so many topics. That's why these are going to be quick hits. But Chris Claremont was the only other guy that was bringing in people that were exclusively for violence. Mr. Sinister, violence. Scalp Hunter, firearms experts, violence. And they kept that edge. And I think 1986 was a really, really big year as far as us growing up.
Yeah, and them allowing for comics to be taken seriously with the violence and stuff like that. And even with the sort of censoring that you mentioned with, of course, the changing of the color of the blood in the book, they still allowed, in my opinion, for the better, to show the true nature of how Batman's violence can really be lethal. I mean, for instance, you have the situation with the kidnapped boy of the very rich family, where they say, like, oh man, I'll kill him, I'll do it. And then he just simply shoots him with the gun and says, I believe you, right? Showing how brutal he could possibly be. Of course, that sparks a whole different debate with a lot of different people like, well, did he actually kill him? Like, they go through all these different things. Like, no, he shot the guy. It's undisputed in my opinion.
Dude, Michael Keaton dropped a bomb in the guy's drawers and he blew up.
Yeah, I mean, look at the scene in Axis Chemicals where he freaking drops a bomb and kills like 20 Joker goons. But this movie or this book allowed for Batman's violence and action to be taken seriously, to where there was weight to it. It wasn't just simply like I love the Arkham games, don't get me wrong, but there's shots where he's like shoving people's heads into like energy or electric boxes, right? And somehow they're not dead. Like, it's showing like, no, like his violence is pretty brutal. And it makes Batman more intimidating, in my personal opinion. This is a Batman that I feel like for the first time in a while in comics was intimidating. And that you could see like, oh yeah, this guy could pummel some people and actually strike fear into the hearts of criminals. Like, one of my favorite panels in this one as well is the one where he's interrogating the guy who's working for Two-Face. And he's covering his eyes. And the guy's saying, okay, well, I'll tell you everything you need to know, but I walk. And Batman tells him, you're in no position to negotiate. Let me show you. And he's hanging him upside down over the city, and the terror on his face. Like, that's Batman just not holding any stops as far as getting information when he needs to know to do what he needs to do. And I love a unrestrained Batman.
This one right here is one of my favorite ones. This is right where Carrie Kelly becomes Robin. She kind of sneaks around and she takes the suit, and that's where he meets him. And you see the situation. He's still thinking about Dick. He's still thinking about, he sees her, but he's still thinking about Dick. He sees her, and he hasn't come in. And this is on the actually this particular one on the back of it. This is that one of my favorite things that they ever did, and this is the one I had the statue of, and it's the one with the slingshot. I couldn't find a good picture of it, but I will probably add it when I re-edit this and put it in. Right now we're filming this. We're recording this, guys, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we'll probably add to it because there's some vivid imagery that we want you to get to understand how big this comic. One of the most important comics to come out after this was an even more disturbing comic, and that's one of the ones we'll probably hit. We have to The Killing Joke.
Yeah.
If the Dark Knight Returns doesn't happen, the Killing Joke, in my opinion, doesn't happen.
I absolutely agree.
Wow, they do things in the Killing Jokes that shocked me. Remember, this is 1989.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't imply sex, or we knew it happened.
Like that. Right.
You didn't imply brutalization of women, even though we knew it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And what he does to Barbara Gordon and the graphic nature that he does it in, that doesn't happen without the Dark Knight giving people the appetite for more to move. It actually was a counter to what we had prior to 1986. We were done with that. Not only were we done with that version of Batman, we wanted more of not just Batman, but we wanted his enemies to reflect him.
Yeah.
And by setting the standard of Frank Miller's Bruce Wayne, you set the standard for Alan Moore's Joker, who was solely, and these things all influenced Heath Ledger, Joaquin Phoenix, everybody but Jack Nicholson, who just basically was Jack Nicholson with light makeup on.
Right.
But if you look at the Jokers that have come and played the Joker or portrayed the Joker, you got to look at the Killing Joke.
The Dark Knight Returns and the Killing Joke, in my opinion, are some of the ones that allowed a lot of comic book villains to be as brutal as they could be. Because before then, like, again, referring back to the Adam West show, there's, of course, a lot of different examples. But in the Adam West show, most of the villains were just simply just people in costumes who were just kind of like, really, really campy and just kind of doing some subtle things that were kind of illegal. So Batman's like going after, make sure they're stopped and all of that. But after this era of comics, villains were allowed to be unleashed. You could allow a villain to be just absolutely unbridled. Again, you mentioned the Killing Joke, with Joker just doing unspeakable things, like killing people, like doing things with Barbara Gordon, like that's serious of a take of a lot of these villains does not happen with these without these comics coming out.
I remember sitting around after the Killing Joke came out, because that was another permission slip comic book.
Yeah.
And that one needed it. That one put a lot of people in tough positions to explain what the Joker did. And obviously the goal was to drive Commissioner Gordon mad and to show that Batman, that your order, and same thing Heath Ledger would bring about, your order is a joke. Your order doesn't work. It's only as good as the next situation that breaks you.
Right.
And Batman didn't affect him simply because he was already broken. But Commissioner Gordon was the person that said, and I remember a quote in the Killing Joke, bring him in by the book. You have to show him that our way works. And the entirety of that was the Joker trying to basically break down, showing his helpless daughter with a bullet in her spine, and that you can't, all your rules and regulations, you couldn't even help her. And it was mind twisting. And I'm 15 reading this. And that took it to a whole new level. The Dark Knight was just violence. We had seen violence on TV. Every movie I'd seen was violence. This was sadistic torture.
Yeah.
And I, at the time, thought it may have gone too far. In retrospect, this kind of stuff that was going on in the 80s that was kept from us kids, in retrospect, unfortunately, it fit right in. And when you look at it in retrospect and you see psychopaths like BTK, you see psychopaths like John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy and Zodiac Killer and all these people that play mind games and do violence, it wasn't too far. It was right on the point. But at the time, and same thing with Dark Knight, we didn't want our comic books to be on point yet. We weren't ready for that. We wanted the place to go away and hide and for everything to turn out good. But like I said, we wanted that, and then we outgrew that. So then we ended up with the Dark Knight. And like I said, if I have a top 5 of the most influential storylines of all time, Dark Knight is nearer at the top. It is so important on so many different levels. There's so much stuff that we don't have right now. Even the Pattinson Batman right now.
Right.
I mean, there is no lineage for even the Christian Bale Batman or the Michael Keaton Batman if we don't have the baseline that is Frank Miller's Dark Knight. And the baseline for Frank Miller storytelling in general. The guy just flat out knows how to tell stories, but thank God that they gave him a pillar character like this. because they didn't do that for Alan Moore, and we'll discuss that down the line. They did not do. When Alan Moore said he was going to kill major characters and and permanently scar people and permanently do things to people, they didn't say, no, we can't do that because we need these characters, down the line. So they gave him other characters. They wouldn't let him do it with the Charlton characters, like Dr. Manhattan, the Atom, all these mainline characters. They gave him characters of his own to do it, and so that you could kill him. Right. And that was, remember, this was happening at the same time the Dark Knight was being released. Yeah, they were released in the 85. Watchmen was 85, 86, and Dark Knight was right in the heart of 86, and then Mutant Man. So this, wow, if I could take you in a TARDIS to 1986, man, dude, it was just a completely different. But you had to read this though, right? You had to experience this though, and one of the things about the internet that I do not like, for all of its advancements and all the great stuff that we have here, we got tablets, we got instantaneous everything, right? When this came out, you had to experience yourself. You had to read it. You couldn't. No one could experience it for you. No one could. There
weren't video reviews that told you their opinion and therefore warped your own sense of what the story was. You had to read it for yourself and think for yourself what you thought of it.
Yeah, and you had to form an opinion. And like I said, if you were my age, you had to form an opinion that was totally against everything you'd ever been shown about Batman. Mm. And so this flipped the script. This flipped the script in more ways than one. And the reason why I bring it up on this show is not only did it flip the script, it does so in a way that it continues to do so. I mean, it's happening now. Like I said, even people who don't know that they've been influenced or are being influenced by this comic, they are. Yeah. I wasn't even alive when that came out. Doesn't matter. It's like not knowing your grandparents. You still share their lineage. You still got to know who they are. Mm-hmm. So let me here's another classic. And the use of the colors. The use of the colors in The Dark Knight Returns. Superman is in all of his glory. He is the red, white, and blue symbol of America. Yeah. He's not dimmed down. He's not his hair is perfect. His skin tone is perfect. He is the exact opposite in that picture. If you ever needed to see the differences in the perceptions of Superman and Batman, they're right there. The dark and gritty Batman in his grays and his black and his stubble and everything else versus a perfect all-American with his perfect Ronald Reagan hair at the time because Ronald Reagan was president there.
Right. And then you have stuff like this page right here where he's just got the unbuttoned shirt. He's just standing there. Just the perfect specimen of a person, of a human being. And then, of course, like you mentioned, you have Bruce Wayne there, an aged, older, bruised, battered, psychologically damaged human being. You couldn't flip the script any harder than between those characters.
Yeah. You had one guy who was feeling the years. Mm. And the other guy who was just and what he was trying to say is none of the stuff that affects you and me and Gotham will ever affect you. Mm. You will always, it's always been so easy for him. So, and this is one of those things that I thought that just was a perfect placement. Another thing that The Dark Knight did, and I flipped through this just now and I realized that I probably should have, because this is something else that when they were doing the news,
yes,
how they broke down the panels into the screen was one of my favorite things. And I'll probably when I edit this in, I'll probably edit you guys better pictures in there so that you can see what we mean. That wasn't happening back before then. Right. Panel was a panel. And when they're watching, it was WNN or whatever their pseudo CNN thing is, the way they broke that down was beautiful. And this was mind-blowing. Like I said, today's kids and today's grown-ups will see it and they'll be like, wow, that's great. That's cool. But because they've been blown away now by things that set the standard, this wasn't the standard until this came out.
Right.
What Watchmen was doing, like I said, I cannot wait to jump on Watchmen because Watchmen did it on levels that was so different. In the middle of the Cold War, one of the things that Watchmen, we were living that Cold War that they were talking about.
Yeah.
It was the mid-'80s.
It was hitting home.
I was on an Air Force base, growing up on an Air Force base, and all Air Force bases in America are nuclear targets if it ever hit the fan. That's just a fact. Every strategic thing that Uncle Sam can use to launch anything against the enemy, every naval base, all your bases are on the target. So I'm living in one, And I'm watching The Watchmen, but like I said, don't want to digress because that one's going to go forever. Kingdom Come and Watchmen are the two ones. And then we're going to get into some Marvel stuff. Like I said, the Mutant Massacre, why the Mutant Massacre is a very important series. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to let these guys, especially the guys I'm selling books to today, understand how you got here with this, right, and why you should be going back and buying back issues, why you should, if you can't afford back issues, I understand, because they've gone up and times are tough. But if you got 15, 20 bucks, to do this, if you're watching these characters on the big screen, that's why we have an as seen on TV section here in the store, because 75% of the people that I meet that come through our store, they're tourists, but they're also people who know these IPs, but they don't have the paper in their hand. I had a kid today, loves Iron Man, loves Robert Downey Jr., never picked up an Iron Man comic.
Right.
And that's what it is, because they're not coming to the stores yet because nobody's put the line.
All right. So you're talking about like all these comics that came out that influenced what came before and the importance of people reading them. And I think one thing that'll help a lot of people do is to open a lot of people's minds as far as comic book movie storytelling, especially today. Like there's a lot of people with a very fixed mindset as to how characters should be written, how characters should act in movies, TV shows, and comics and all of that. But if they go back and read all these things, they'll see the evolutions of these characters. They'll see that the different perspectives of different writers in these characters are important. And so to show them like there's a different way to view these characters in different lights, in different circumstances, in different situations. And so, like you said, if people just go back and collect or just at least read some of these older stories that came before to influence what is coming now, they'll just have a better perspective of that and a broader understanding, I think.
Yeah, and I think that another thing that it will do, if they can get the physical media in their hand, is when it comes to, like you said, different interpretations of the character, it doesn't all, the way the MCU rolls out characters is different than the way the characters rolls out in comics.
Yeah.
The MCU in any comic book franchises, they've done what they've needed to do to narrate their story, and I have no problem with that.
Right.
But what I would love for people to understand is that over the course of decades, different writers have taken on these characters and taken them into different trajectories. Kevin Feige and the people he employs are just one writer.
Yeah.
There are a different version of Spider-Man that you can appreciate that is not on the big screen. There's a different version of Iron Man that you can appreciate that's been written and drawn by somebody else that you can appreciate that's not on the big screen. And when it comes to DC and Marvel, you have 8 decades. You have even more time than you've had with Marvel. And when you say, well, that's not my Batman, well, there's no such thing as a my Batman. Everybody had their Batman. There's been 80 my Batmans over the past 80 years. There's been 80 my Supermans. There's different interpretations and different runs. And understand that there's different times. The 80s was a very different place than 2022. Trust me. Yeah. It was a very different place. You would not be getting away with swastikas on your boobs today. It just wouldn't happen.
No.
The 80s, I'm telling you something about the 80s. It wasn't as politically correct as things are right now. You could drop N-bombs in areas that would get you fired and terminated today and disappeared. There were certain things you could do and say about, female culture that you could not say and do today. The Killing Joke, the things that they do, Alan Moore would have been Me Too'd for The Killing Joke. So it's just a different time, different place. But when you read these stories that come from those times, you can appreciate the fact that these characters have been around a really, really long time. And they have the people that are writing your stories are drawing not just from the final version in your head, but decades and decades and decades and the Dark Knight. Trust me, if you're doing a Batman story in the modern era, somehow, some way, somebody who you pay as an actor or actress has drawn inspiration from the Dark Knight or stories that came out in that area, whether it be the Dark Knight with Heath Ledger, whether it be the Killing Joke with Joaquin Phoenix's elements of that. These guys there's all these creations are composites of what has gone before. And the biggest thing that has gone before, in my opinion, was Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, released 36 years ago, I think this week, as a matter of fact. The fact that I've been around for something that was released 36 years ago, and I'm not taking lots of vitamins and fiber and stuff, I think is pretty impressive.
I'd say so. I mean, good for you, man.
Yeah, I'm on the screen with somebody who wasn't even alive then. That's what this means, though.
Yeah.
That's what this means. This is generational now. what he put out in 1986 has become generational in its effect. And I think that is great. That's going to be the same case, in my opinion, for everything that we do with the Sci-Fi Center presents when we present these stories. The Watchmen. I mean, I can't think of something that binds generations closer and closer together than Watchmen does. Kingdom Come. I mean, there's so many things. Even though the Cold War is over, look what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with Russians starting wars in Europe.
Yeah.
What were we dealing with in 1985, 1986? Russian Soviet oppression in Europe. So everything comes full circle, and you start to appreciate these storylines. So I'm glad I'm able to do something like this. I'm glad we have the format to do something like this. Dawson, tell them where they can find you.
Oh, yes. You can find me on Twitter at my tag right here. The Twitter page is called DJW Art, and I just post a lot of my art on there. Also, you can find me on the Four Nerds Network YouTube channel. We do the Four Nerds Show every single Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And coming up pretty soon, there'll be more frequent streams where I'll actually be streaming my own creative process or art streams where I'm just simply drawing my different pieces that I do throughout the week. So people will be able to see me and interact with me more in that way in the next couple of weeks and going forward after that. And on Instagram as well, at DJW32Art, I believe is the tag, or just look up DJW Art and you'll be able to find it.
I'll put the links in a graphic after we wrap it up so everybody can find us as well.
Yeah.
You can find me just by Googling the Sci-Fi Center. I am on the Poindexter Lounge, which is what you're watching right now at Sci-Fi Center Presents. I have my own YouTube page where we'll be doing something like this, but in a much shorter fashion, 5 and 10 minute hits of like why Blade Runner is important, things like that, things that go beyond the pale. And that's our show for our very first the Sci-Fi Center Presents. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Follow the graphics and stuff, and I will be giving you some homework if you want to go along this path with us and start reading the stuff that is relevant to where we're at today. I will be posting a graphic of that, and I'll be posting links in the bios and everything else. Until next week, guys, where I'm pretty sure we're going to be hitting the Watchmen, but I'll make that official soon. All right, nice. Thanks, guys.